So this is my reflection, commentary, and reading of the Platonic dialogue, the Statesman. I'm not going to give a comprehensive summary of where we have been because we have been many places. I think we are roughly 22 or 23 hours into this dialogue in terms of recording. So there's no way that I'd be able to capture all of that again. What I'd like to do is just sort of give some general thoughts about where we've been in the most immediate sense. Because I just ended episode 11 in the middle of a thought. And so I'd like to sort of pick up where we left off. So I'd like to read a few paragraphs about what the visitor has been saying so far. So he says, "Are we to say, that is, between us, that if a doctor, or else some gymnastic trainer, were going to be out of the country and away from his charges for what he thought would be a long time, and thought that the people being trained, or his patients, would not remember the instructions he had given them, he would want to write down reminders for them? Or what are we to say?" To this young Socrates agrees. He says, "As you suggested." And the visitor continues, "But what if he came back unexpectedly, having been away for less time than he thought he would be? Do you think he wouldn't propose other prescriptions contrary to the ones that he had written down, when things turned out to be different and better for his patients because of winds or else some other things that had come from Zeus, which had come about contrary to expectation, in some way differently than the usual pattern? Would he obstinately think that neither he nor the patient should step outside those ancient laws that had once been laid down, he himself by giving other instructions, the patient by daring to do different things contrary to what was written down, on the grounds that these were the rules of the art of medicine and of health, and that things that happened differently were unhealthy and not part of his expertise? Or would all such things, if they happened in the context of truly expert knowledge, cause altogether the greatest ridicule in all spheres for acts of legislation of this sort? Now to this I didn't really articulate in the last episode, but I think of two potential interpretations. That the ridicule can come from those who adhere tightly to the established order, and the ridicule can come from those reasonable people who see the broader perspective at whole. And this would imply that when true expertise comes along that is contrary to some established order, institution, convention, whatever it happens to be, then any such rules that would attempt to deny the truth when it comes along, even if it is against the established institution, would cause altogether the greatest ridicule in all spheres for acts of legislation of this sort. So I sort of want to keep this in mind. Of course, we are thinking about the goodness that exists here. So we are preferencing that act of legislation that would be against denying the truth of something, or the true expertise of something. To this young Socrates says, "Absolutely right." And the visitor continues, "And as for the person who has written down what is just and unjust, fine and shameful, good and bad, or has laid down unwritten laws on these subjects, for all those herds of human beings that graze, city by city, according to the laws of those who wrote them down in each case, if the person who wrote them on the basis of expertise, or someone else resembling him arrives, is it really not to be permitted to him to give different instructions contrary to these? Or wouldn't this prohibition appear in truth no less ridiculous than the other one?" Okay, so what do we have here? What is the visitor outlining for us? we have a person that is described as almost pure potential. Like he has a little bit of both in everything. He has written down what is just and unjust, fine and shameful, good and bad. He has laid down unwritten laws, these sort of interwoven establishment, constitutional, axiomatic principles that people just sort of adhere to. So we don't need laws explicit in every single case. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. There's a certain shared, established cultural set of morals and customs that they all adhere to. He says, for all those herds of human beings that graze. An interesting image, the sort of the common person, the working person, the person that is in the experience, not the person that's sort of looking at the whole of it and how it relates to each other and how the strings of the cloth are interwoven, so to speak. City by city, according to the laws of those who wrote them down in each case. So here we have the introduction of the concept of the expanse of time, for which the person at time zero when we started talking, and as for the person who had written down what is just, what is unjust, fine and shameful, blah blah blah, this person exists in a particular point in that chain link. And he carries with him the information, the material, the memories of days past, of conventions past, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them fine, some of them shameful, just like we have established. So we have an image of a person that is a link in a chain in the linear time scale, but we also have a bit of a vertical in the sense that there might be a distribution of decision making. While one person may be the head of something, like an executive, there's still an underlying bureaucracy, some of it advisory, some of it just sort of gears that make the decision machine into something practical and enforceable. And I say this because the visitor refers to those who wrote them down in each case. And he doesn't say the person as we started out in the singular. He sort of goes into this multiplicity and then there's the implication that it's possible for one person or again for multiple people to decide on some of these important factors or have at least influence over them. Then he comes up with the idea of a person that comes in with expertise, true expertise, or somebody resembling him. And he has new ideas. It would be an odd thing to say that because these ideas, although they are true, and matter of fact in their expertise, that it would be unwise to permit such changes because they go against convention. Now young Socrates agrees with this and he says, of course. The visitor says, well then, do you know what the majority of people say in such a case? Young Socrates says, it doesn't come to mind for the moment, just like that. The visitor says, well, it sounds fine enough. What they say is that if someone recognizes laws that are better, contrary to those established by people before him, then he must introduce them by persuading his city to accept them in each case, but not otherwise. So this method of persuasion is fundamental. It prevents the tyranny of a particular type of conservatism that is so rigid that it won't change in the face of that which is has been set down through the ages and established. And like with many things, there are varying degrees of this. There are varying degrees of structures or institutions that have had some a longer history than others, some that have had deeper impact on the foundations of a society, of an ontological expression, and some less so, and some I think are more malleable than others. And also we have the circumstance for which some of these principles maybe have been obscured or forgotten by the nature of the relations of our societies. As institutions change, as I've mentioned in the last episode, the expression of goodness changes. So what in one circumstance may be grounds for a strong conservative principle is, in a different context, manifest in such a way that what comes about is a greater disharmony rather than harmony. So one way to mitigate against this is sort of a type of argumentation, that of a challenge, or rather that if somebody wishes to change something, then they have to undergo the process of persuasion. Young Socrates responds, and he says, "Well then, is that not a correct view?" And the visitor says, "But first things first. If someone forces through what is better without the use of persuasion, tell me, what will be the name to give to use of force in this case?" "No, not yet. Answer me first in relation to the previous case." So let's try our best to answer this question, because it's an interesting thought experiment. If somebody knows that something is true, for whatever reason they push something through by force, what would we call this? Would we still call it a tyranny? Would we call it oppressive? I suppose to a degree we would call it a tyranny. But on one hand, a tyrant doesn't seem to exercise truth in that way. They usually exercise self-interest and self-motivation over the well-being of the collective. The harmony is not a strong consideration. But surely we can do better than this. For the tyrant is something that I loosely understand. So I think I have to think about the person that sidesteps persuasion. They sacrifice something. They sacrifice, I think, a desire of cooperation, but it is for a greater good. But if tyrants don't always start here, it's hard to say exactly what a tyrant is. It's only in the case where the ends are not good and the means are not well. This is where the age-old expression comes from: do the ends justify the means? Do the means, in fact, make the person the tyrant, even if the ends turn out to be good? But surely we can say that if the ends are poor, the means are poor, then we have a tyrant. Or if the ends are poor and the means are good, we wouldn't say that we have a tyrant, we would say that we have a poor leader, somebody who is unwise. And so I think there is sort of a problem in the case of a person who does not wish to achieve his ends by persuasion, because there is a contradiction between what he attempts to be in his expert status, which is an expert weaver, of integrating threads together such that we have a coherent cloth. He may do this in many facets, but without the public interest, I have to imagine if it is possible. There are many ideas, I'm sure, that I haven't thought about, but This is at least what comes to mind. Now young Socrates says, "What do you mean?" The visitor says, "If then, to continue with our example, someone does not persuade his patient, but has a correct grasp of the relevant expertise, and forces child or man or woman to do what is better, contrary to what has been written down, what will be the name to give to this use of force? Surely anything rather than what we call an unhealthy mistake contrary to the expertise in question. And the last thing, the person who was the object of such force can correctly say about such a thing is that he had unhealthy things done to him by the doctors who used force on him, things that did not belong to their expertise." So let's start from the beginning. So someone does not persuade his patient, but has a correct grasp of the relevant expertise. So in this context, it doesn't necessarily seem that this person is a tyrant, but they seem to be, again, playing in a territory that is uncertain. A type of breach of a trust, perhaps, because he is forcing a child or man or woman to do what is better. And so there's an inherent thing in me about this force. And I have to question, is there something truly negative about this compulsion to do something against one's will? Because I think ultimately this is what it boils down to. If a person is not persuaded to do something for their health, and they are forced to do so, then they do not believe that what they are being forced to do is correct. They will be persuaded in the end, I suppose. But if they're not part of the journey, I have to wonder. Perhaps it is the tyrant. Contrary to what has been written down, what will be the name to give to this use of force? Now, it's not explicitly deception, because we're not talking about deceptive methods. We're talking about restrictive methods. We're talking about controlling methods. We're talking about authoritative, but not authoritative in the sense of authority, because this person has the relevant expertise. Well, perhaps they do have the authority if they are in the position of the gymnastic instructor or the physician, as we've spoken of earlier. So they have a position of authority. We could say of this person that they are a bit hubristic, because what if they are wrong? How can they be so certain that they are correct? But it's a bit of a cop-out to say that, because in this situation it is assumed that they know what is correct by their expertise. Now, in some sense, we can say that this is a father figure, because to a child, they are forced to do things all of the time. It has nothing to do with their will or their desires. They are forced to do something because they must do it. They must learn that lesson. And so the father here is more of a benevolent figure than he is seen to be malevolent, like a tyrant. It must be done in that situation. Or perhaps we can say that because of the force, he becomes malevolent for a moment. And it's not until the child begins to reflect and to understand that his actions become benevolent. A temporary tyranny. Surely anything rather than what we called an unhealthy mistake contrary to the experience in question, continues the visitor. And we can't necessarily call it an unhealthy mistake because it's not a mistake and it's not unhealthy. And the last thing the person who was the object of such force can correctly say about such a thing is that he had unhealthy things done to him by the doctors who used force on him, things that did not belong to their expertise. And so, just like we've mentioned, this is the cudgel that they can hold over the doctors. But it has nothing to do with the end result. What you say is very true, says young Socrates. Visitor. He says, and what do we really suppose to be the sort of mistake we're talking about? The one in contravention of the expertise of the statesman? Isn't it what is shameful, what is bad, and unjust? I agree, absolutely, says young Socrates. The visitor. Then those who have been forced, contrary to what has been written down and to ancestral custom, to do things different that are more just, better, and finer than things they did before, tell me, if people in this kind of situation for their part censure this kind of use of force, isn't it true that, if their censure isn't to be the most laughable of all, they must say anything on each occasion rather than that those who have been forced have had shameful, unjust, and bad things done to them by those who did the forcing? So this natural reservation that I have continues, but it's not a reservation that I think is perhaps unreasonable, but rather it is something that is found with a degree of subtlety. I'll try to explain what I mean. So this matter of force, I know I've touched on it. Other than some modern weak sensibility that causes me to be apprehensive of the term, I think in the context of what we consider to be an expertise that wishes to accomplish its ends by harmony, but all the while understanding that in particular cases for which a collective has strayed so far from what is to be considered good and fine, that in order for them to survive, they must be forced into a particular type of disposition so that they may see what is true at the end of it. I understand how this is something that can come about. But since we're talking about, potentially, the coming to be in such a harmonious manner that force and the use of trickery that perhaps would be more akin to the toolkit of the sophist is rather an individual that wishes to, as the visitor says, censure or decry aloud against some contravention. I would not want it to seem that the tools that are used to reorient the mind are akin to those that maintain the current order, because, well, Perhaps I'm wrong here, but as I think about this, the tools of force are used to maintain convention. At the end of laws, we have something that is enforceable. Now, it's a dangerous thing, but sometimes a necessary thing, to use the same force towards the same ends, towards goodness, when one has discovered that actually what is wrong is the convention, and what is true is the contravention. Then the use of force in that case would be justified because it is moving towards what is good. Now, still in the back of my mind, this forcing. I was watching a video the other day. I've gotten into this habit of watching on YouTube the Midwest police videos, a lot of body cam footage and all this sort of thing. And there's a video that I saw today. I'm not really sure where it was, of course somewhere in the Midwest, but somebody had been shot, and there was a group of people. There was a lot of people, and it was in an area with a lot of bars, so immediately I think one can conjure up exactly what this play looked like and sounded like. And when the police arrived, there were a bunch of people surrounding the person that had been shot, and his good friend was over him, and everybody was getting very agitated. They were already very excited about the events that occurred. And their excitement turned to anger and frustration against the police. Of course, the police were there to help the person that was shot. And the people that were around this individual, presumably some that knew this person, were obstructing the care for this person. And eventually, the paramedics arrive. They put the person on the stretcher. I think the person ultimately died. But the interesting thing was that there were a number of people arrested that had nothing to do with the shooting, but they were arrested because they were obstructing the police officer's duty and trying to help the individual. So it was a rather bizarre scene. And in this way, I reflect on force. Now, it's not an exact parallel in terms of somebody going against an established convention because they know something to be true. It's actually the opposite. The established convention of getting everybody out of the way, having the police and paramedics handle it, is the right thing to do. This is the traditional thing that we've always done. And the influence of everybody around the contravention in this situation was poorly apt to move anything towards any sort of semblance of goodness. But all the same, the example of force in the execution of what is good is seen here in the sense that there were people that didn't understand, at least at some level, that they have to step aside, sacrifice some of their immediate emotional concerns, and let people who are not just individual, but a part of a collective and established series of institutions and of a structured framework such that an individual can be transported to a hospital and be seen by somebody who has an expertise in saving lives. And so when I say that I struggle a little bit with this word force, pause for a moment, because in this practical situation, the use of force is entirely justified. The people that would otherwise crowd their friend would unknowingly, unwillingly perhaps, be killing him because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to stop the bleeding. They don't have the tools to stop it. And so I can perfectly see how this use of force, especially under particular circumstances, is necessary. And I want to reread again something that the visitor says. He says, "Tell me, if people in this kind of situation for their part censure this kind of use of force, isn't it true that, if their censure isn't to be the most laughable of all, they must say anything on each occasion rather than that those who have been forced have had shameful, unjust, and bad things done to them by those who did the forcing?" So here comes back to mind this discussion earlier about the potential tyranny. And this would be the laughable part, that this would be considered a tyranny, because we are moving towards the good. In the case of the doctor, when we think about the scalpel, he goes in to cut some surface, to do some harm, but it's temporary harm for the sake of broader good. Now, not long ago, in fact today, I think, there were these protests that I think were referred to as Stop the King or something, in which the people that were protesting across cities in the United States are protesting against Donald Trump's perceived executive authority and the treatment of immigrants that have come into this country. And there are many ways to approach that problem, because on one hand, when we think about the body, and we think about the elements that make it up, we just think about an identity in general, and the elements that make up that identity. If the elements, or the parts, are too disagreeable by their dissimilarity, there will be no unity. If there are too many people that establish their tribes within this country, that do not speak the same language and have different cultures, there will be conflict, and national unity will suffer because of it. I think that there is a very poor representation of Donald Trump as a king in this situation. The act is quite clearly an act to promote harmony, to save the polity, to save the society from disintegrating into parts. That's not to say that immigration is bad, and surely Donald Trump, I'm sure, would say that immigration is not a bad thing. But there is a proper measure to this sort of thing, and this is where, in our concern, the statesman, or the true statesman, comes into play. Now, I can't claim that Donald Trump is a true statesman, but certainly among the others for which he participates in, he seems to be outside of that milieu. He is a bit of a contravention to what, up until this point, has been brought to the American public under a particular guise. And it's by this guise that we have all sort of been fooled, unfortunately. So I think one can say that force without wisdom is tyranny. Wisdom without the courage to apply force is impotence. And the statesman's art is the harmony of both of them. So young Socrates responds to the visitor saying, what you say is very true." And the visitor continues, "But are the things forced on them just, if the person who did the forcing is rich, and unjust if he happens to be poor? Or if, whether by using persuasion or not, whether as a rich or a poor man, or according to written law or contrary to it, he does what is not to the benefit of the citizens, or what is to their benefit? Must that be the criterion, and must it have to do with these things, the truest criterion of correct government of a city, the one according to which the wise and good man will govern the interests of the ruled? Just as a steersman, always watching out for what is to the benefit of the ship and the sailors, preserves his fellow sailors not by putting things down in writing, but offering his expertise as law, so too, in this same manner, a constitution would be correct, would it not, if it issued from those who are able to rule in this way, offering the strength of their expertise as more powerful than the laws? And there is no mistake, is there, for wise rulers, whatever they do, provided that they watch for one great thing, that by always distributing to those in the city what is most just, as judged by the intelligent application of their expertise, they are able both to preserve them, and so far as they can bring it about, that they are better than they were. So here we come back to a theme that we've seen earlier, and this is of the independence of the state of the man in question. If he has true expertise, then expertise is the thing that stands alone, regardless of his status. So the first sentence: "But are the things forced on them just, if the person who did the forcing is rich, and unjust if he happens to be poor?" So here at this point, I think it's going to be useful to maybe reflect on the nature of the good and what is just. We've established that laws are a type of memory, but they are rigid. And by their rigidity, it can cause a disharmony, especially as the relations among things change. And necessarily those laws, those parameters by which people are oriented must also be changed, even if it is to be at the expense of convention. At the backdrop of all of this, what there is that gives life to law is the true expert, but also the Constitution. The Constitution can be developed by a series of experts, like in the case of the American Revolution, or can be stated. And I have to think in this situation that prerogative of statement is more akin to the king than it is to the statesman. But speaking about justice and speaking about that which is good, and harmony as the way in which we relate things together, such that they bring about this expression of what is just or what is good, I can't help but to think about music here. This music is at least for me, it's such a fundamental expression. It is something that is intuitive. Now, I'm a very poor guitar player, but I have two acoustic guitars. And what I end up doing is playing the same thing over and over and over again. But it satisfies my mind in the sense that there is some coherence, that I can make something sound agreeable. And in that way it seems to be just. It seems to be harmonious. Now, all the while understanding that there is a way to understand this in terms of proportion and in terms of ratios, my mind is not sophisticated enough in that learning to be able to describe it in that way. But I do have my guitar sitting in my lap, and the first thing that I'll do is pluck the open E string, Now I can pose the question, did I do a good thing or a bad thing? Did I do a harmonious thing or a disharmonious thing? And I think the answer to that would be neither. And how is it possible that while I've done some action, I've produced some sound, why is it the case that this is not a just action, or rather that it cannot be classified as either just or unjust? Now here I think we are approaching more of something that might be considered just. But to get back to the point, one single pluck of the string doesn't really have enough information to tell us anything. It's like using the king as my symbolic chess piece for that which is good. We start there to think about it philosophically and symbolically, but it's the integration of that which is to other things that are, separated by difference, which is the queen in that symbolic structure, that we come to understand the expression of purpose, meaning, and all things that we value. Now, I've plucked the E string a few times here. I've plucked it a few different areas on the string. Gives us a few different types of tones to it. Some a little bit lower on the, or some a little bit more on the low end, and some a little bit more on the high end, or the treble. But I think that in doing this, although it's a simple modification, if I add some sort of regular pattern to this, we could say that there's some justice in it. Maybe it's unjust if it's interfering with my speech. But if I go about trying to play something, so here there's been something that has been stated. I think it's something that is agreeable. It sounds like something. There's a bit of harmony to it. If I give it a different context, I'll play the same thing again. And then all of a sudden I do this. That doesn't sound like a harmony. It doesn't mean that the note is useless or that it ought to be destroyed. It's just not something that works in the context of this situation. And so this would be like, it could be either a convention or a contravention, but since we're talking about laws eventually becoming something that might be a disharmonious convention, this note needs to be integrated into this in some harmonious way. Otherwise, it's going to be out of context, out of color, and we're going to have a lot of difficulty making sense of this. But if we do something like so, messing around a little bit, but I think that this is the main idea. So again, the point being that notes, by their relations, or in the political sense, or in the sense of general polity, in the sense of the citizenry, the herd, it is the ordering of the notes and the harmony that they produce together, not necessarily they themselves per se. their behavior may need to be changed in relation to the song that is being played, such that it makes sense, that it agrees, that it doesn't turn into a tyranny. So today happens to be a new day, and like usual, a new day brings new thoughts. So, I loosely remember why I decided to go on that guitar analogy. Harmony is one of the principal topic of discussion. And so I know that somewhere in there it was relevant, but for the life of me I can't really remember the particular details. And going back now to retrace my steps, although I think it would be somewhat worthwhile, I just want to move forward. So, with the sake of a minor breach in the continuity here, I'd like to progress this. So again, reading that first sentence into the second, the visitor says, "But are the things forced on them just, if the person who did the forcing is rich, and unjust if he happens to be poor, or if, whether by using persuasion or not, whether as a rich person or a poor man, or according to written law or contrary to it, he does what is not to the benefit of the citizens, or what is to their benefit, must be the criteria, and must it have to do with these things. The truest criterion of correct government of a city, the one according to which the wise and good man will govern the interests of the ruled." So, quite a mouthful to put into one sentence. But I'm pausing for a moment to see if there's anything that we really haven't reflected on in this capacity. We've already established the necessity of the changing nature of law, its establishment into things that are more fundamental, and it's required to be that way because law could be quite rigid, and it has to be adaptable, whether by force or otherwise, in order to accommodate the truth as the relative relations among things shift and change. So the establishment of ground, due measure of identity comes into mind here. We've discussed this rich and poor situation, I think, to a degree. Perhaps it deserves a few extra thoughts. For what does it mean to be a rich man and a poor man? In the Proverbs, we explored this in a way that is greater than just what one has in a monetary sense. Richness and poorness can be quite a vast or a broad topic. For the things that we value, I think, occupy the distinction of what is rich and of what is poor. Now, of course, a certain element of that is money. It is the currency that holds the potential to create or to garner for oneself some material value. The potential to gain property, so to speak. And of course, outside of money, we have other material things that would be considered our property, whether it be land or housing or material objects inside of the place that we live. We can say that what is valuable is some occupational standard. By that occupational standard, of course, it determines a standard of living in the material sense. But then there are more sophisticated things, I think, that of value and of richness or of poorness as it relates to love within one's life, familial, generally relational. And then I think that there is another, and it's more of, well, it's related to what I said about this, the familial type of love, the relational. The relational not only extends to what the individual maintains as his sort of outside relationships, but also his internal relationship to God, or the divine logos, or to what is good. That certainly is an important aspect of this. And I think that it can be quite easily stated that in the absence of material prosperity, the man would be the more in a state of poverty if he lacked proper ontological ground. In fact, there are plenty of people that are of poor material means that have solid ontological foundation. And this solid ontological foundation is either by choice or temporarily so, and it is by their understanding, and again their relationship to the good, that they then are able to move through a society in a way that procures for themselves a standard of living that is sufficient, that is good, so that they do not starve. And all of this at the bedrock has to do with discipline. It has to do with virtue. So let's go through the etymology of the word discipline and the word virtue. So starting from the Latin, we have disciplina, instruction, training, knowledge, derived from discipulus, which is pupil or learner. Discere, meaning to learn, is the deeper Indo-European root, connected to dek, meaning to take, accept, from which we get the idea receiving teaching. It entered Old French as discipline, teaching or moral training, before it was adopted in Middle English as the word discipline. So what necessarily contributes to this learning or education? Well, order by which thought is shaped. We will say this is like the ground of education. And I'll add to that it's the regular, attentive, and I'm not sure what the correct word for this aspect of it would be, but there's a vigor that's associated with it. Attention is a part of it, because in order to apply attention, there needs to be this grounded desire to actually take in the information, to synthesize it, to learn it, and to apply it practically. So I'll say there's a type of vigor that's also associated with that. In the moral and religious context, we take the same sort of attention and care and vigor, and we apply it to regular practices like prayer and fasting. So by the medieval and modern times, we have this idea of external restraint and punishment. It acquired the sense of the correction or enforcement needed to keep the order intact. So we've been talking a bit about laws. I think laws go in there, but it's sort of an integrated law. It's the ontological side of that, such that people aren't always bumping into these arbitrary laws that are set up because the people are so barbarous. It's the internal restraint that is developed through culture and through family, through the upbringing, but also through other practices that may not necessarily be explicitly religious. I think exercise is one of those foundational ones, because it involves all of those fundamental elements. It involves suffering, it involves sacrifice, it involves that vigor, attention, and care. Everything is within it, and there's varying degrees of which one can push themselves. It's something that can be built on, it's something that one loses very quickly. So it's an interesting discipline. So virtue, from Latin virtus, manliness, excellence, moral strength. From the prefix vir, man, hero, rooted in Indo-European viros, adult male, bearer of strength. Through Old French, vertu, it came to Middle English as virtue. So, in the sense, in classical Latin, virtus was the power proper to a man or citizen soldier. In terms of moral excellence, by the Stoics and later Christian writers, virtus came to signify the excellence of soul that fulfills its form: courage, temperance, justice, and prudence. Effective power, even beyond morality, virtue could mean any inherent potency. Virtue of a herb, or virtue of a magnet. So it's interesting that we find virtue grounded within that manly experience. That there is, perhaps within the military tradition and broader, the idea of the hero. That within heroic action, there involves such an experience of perhaps involving discipline, but also of commitment to what one understands to be correct, commitment to a particular duty. And this duty, regardless of the thing itself being right or wrong, I think orders everything outside of that, because our attention is pointed to that. So what we order ourselves away from that is necessarily meant to establish some coherence so we can reach that end goal. What do I mean by that? In our personal affairs, we keep an ordered financial life such that there is stability there. In our domestic life, we keep strong relations to those for whom we love. We maintain order and cleanliness in the home, such that things are easy to find, things are in their proper place, things are not messy. We keep our health in order. We keep our correctness of speech in order. We keep our hearts controlled and tame, and we exercise it when necessary. Again, all pointing to one direction. So all of these things are ordered such that we can control them towards the duty, towards the end, the responsibility that we have. So back to the visitor. I'll read the sentence again. He says, or if, whether by using persuasion or not, so pausing here for a moment, persuasion or not, I think we've discussed this already. Persuasion would be more of the just side of going about reorienting a populace to some narrative that is contrary to that which has been established. And we've certainly explored the use of force. We've explored the laws. We've explored now the rich man, the poor man. Perhaps I didn't speak much on why it doesn't necessarily matter. I've said what composes the rich man and the poor man. But, well, maybe a few more words here I think would be appropriate. So, the idea comes to mind when the visitor says that it's independent, what likely he's referring to, independent of material riches versus poverty. What we are focused on here is the matter of fact, the expertise. And of course, that a man can be quite poor materially but maintain a certain level of expertise that would be requisite to solving this cultural dilemma that we are in the contemporary age, but also in a hypothetical on exactly how the society, the laws, and perhaps the Constitution ought to be oriented such that the distribution of justice is maximized given the current relationships among things, given the institutions and the people. I think it does matter if a man is impoverished with regard to virtue and discipline, but this would go against one of the requirements. It doesn't matter if he's rich or poor as long as he has the expertise. Now, I think as part of their prerequisite of the expertise of being a statesman or a proper king, it would be necessary that they would have this sort of innate or well-developed, perhaps, expression of discipline and of virtue, the absence of which would lead to frequent incorrectness of decision-making, and it would seem that it would be rather impossible to establish an order, a correct order, in the face of one that is already established if these things were not squared away. Now, the next important piece is to discuss when he says he does what is not to the benefit of the citizens or what is to their benefit. So he's saying even the benefit doesn't matter. What matters is the criterion. So again, the criterion I think is going to influence a lot of this. But in the immediate sense, as we've already talked about with regard to laws, it is not necessarily the case that the statesman or the king, when properly oriented, is going to put forth, what would we say, an order that is kind to the populace, especially given their ontological orientation. And I think perhaps in the short term there would be quite a harmful effect on some, especially in the case of an organized rebellion against changes. But on the other hand, the goodness that is introduced is also for the benefit. But in the immediate sense, if benefit does not occur, we can't say that it was a benefit. And so, again, this is relative to the criterion that we're talking about. So then the question emerges, the truest criterion of correct government of a city, the one according to which the wise and good man will govern the interests of the ruled? Now, there's not too much to say here. This question, of course, this is something that we have to explore, these criterion. We've discussed a little bit about what would constitute that, but the just and wise ruler is certainly in a difficult position, to make the necessary changes against a structure that probably, in a collective sense, would almost be like an immune system that is trying to fend off an infection, whereas this pathogen that has come in is meant to reestablish the proper order of the identity of the thing itself, rather than to poison it or whatever the case might be. The visitor continues, he says, just as a steersman, always watching out for what is to the benefit of the ship and the sailors, preserves his fellow sailors not by putting things down in writing, but offering his expertise as law. So too, in this same manner, a constitution would be correct, would it not, if it issued from those who are able to rule in this way, offering the strength of their expertise as more powerful than the laws. So this sort of increases my desire and my hunger for the goodness that is there. If we take our contemporary example, I think everybody feels in their hearts that something is wrong. For those that are subject to inferior desires, or those who wish not to be all that concerned agentically, wish to sort of be told, maybe the feeling will not be as intense in them, but for most of us, I think, this sense of change and instability, the unknown about our current situation, about where we are going, this is at the top of our existential and ontological stress. And what we wish is to have that type of steersman that has things under control. And what we have found is somebody that is disruptive. But the disruptor, I think, has a question mark on him. Is he the type of disruptor that we need? Is he the figure that is appropriate for the present moment? Or is he just a placeholder until we can find somebody more appropriate? It's difficult to say. Now the focus here is on the following. Now I've lost it, I'm trying to find it again. He says, preserves his fellow sailors not by putting things down in writing, but offering his expertise as law. I think there's a lot in here that we have to talk about. The first thing is that we are seeing two different layers. The ship is the collective. It is the society. It is the civil order. It is the culture. And all of the various, once we move into that thing, that identity, all the various parts of it. So the institutions, the educational sphere, the civil sphere, the ecclesiastical sphere, the sort of industrial economic market sphere. All of these things together are the ship that we consider. And the sailors are the souls that give life to these various institutional structures. Now there's the distinction about not writing these things down, or at least it's not his responsibility to write these things down. It's his expertise that is law. Now one could easily question, well, surely he can write these things down, and that would be a transfer of his expertise. And so there's some way in which the writing down, the codification or the solidification of the thing is not enough. And this is already something that we've abundantly established, but I'll say it again since he mentions it here. That the reason that he ought not to write this down, and rather it is his expertise that is law, because there are many adverse events that can befall a ship or befall sailors. Some events can be quite standard, and a simple procedure that is known to all, as followed by all, can be established. And there can be some procedures that are developed within the crew such that the officers maintain that order. Some of it has to do with the security of the ship. Some of it has to do with repair. Some of it has to do with navigation. I mean, there's a lot of these sorts of things. But the expertise implies a sense of dynamic judgment. in the sense that when an event happens, there may not be some procedure or rule that is written down such that it is able to be solved. And because of this, what needs to happen is a moment in time where the leader makes an executive decision. And this executive decision takes into account the relationship among the identities. So this is on the vertical level, I suppose, we can say that we have the ship as a whole. Maybe above the ship we can have where the ship is going, or the purpose of the journey or of the voyage. And we move all the way down to the individuals. If a sailor gets sick, or if there's an outbreak, disease on the ship, what can be done then? Perhaps there's an attack on the ship. Perhaps there's something unforeseen about the destination, or the nature of the voyage has changed mid-journey, and certain procedures have to be put into place. Not only navigation, but also in terms of orientation of the crew. We spoke of duty and obligation earlier. It is of the duty and obligation of the crewsmen to commit themselves to whatever task, whatever orders they are given. And if that changes, it requires a bit of a shift, but the discipline remains the same. And so this is a bit of our ontological orientation I think we spoke of earlier. The visitor continues. He says, so too, in this same manner, a constitution would be correct. So in the same manner, meaning in the manner of expertise rather than of law. Would it not, if it is issued from those who are able to rule in this way, offering the strength of their expertise as more powerful than the laws? We've already talked about this. And there is no mistake, is there, for wise rulers, whatever they do, provided that they watch for one great thing, that by always distributing to those in the city what is most just, as judged by the intelligent application of their expertise, they are able both to preserve them, and so far as they can to bring it about that they are better than they were. So a seemingly straightforward statement, but much harder in practice. That's why we have to continually drive home the idea of discipline and of virtue, because this is something of constant attention. It's not just something that is solved by intermediate concern and care. It's constant. It is a battle, a struggle all the way through. Now in Socrates' response, he says, it is certainly not possible to contradict what has just been said. The visitor, and neither should one contradict those other things we said. What are you referring to? That a mass of any people whatsoever would never be able to acquire this sort of expert knowledge and so govern a city with intelligence, and that we must look for that one constitution, the correct one, in relation to a small element in the population, few in number, or even a single individual, putting down the other constitutions as imitations, as was said a little earlier, some of them imitating this one for the better, others for the worse. So we're really getting down to the nuts and bolts here. I wonder how we're going to move into this thought experiment, or if we're just going to be staying at this introductory level of saying, okay, there's a problem, we have to have a good person that does all of this. Of course, it's good to think about this and center the mind on it, but if we don't think about a practical implication about what it means to weave together these things, then we haven't really done some strong philosophical work. Young Socrates says, "What do you mean by this? What are you saying? For I did not understand the point about imitations when it was made just now either." Visser says, "And it's no small matter. If one stirs up this subject and then proceeds to leave it where it is instead of going through it and showing the mistake that now occurs in relation to it, what mistake is that? This sort of thing we must hunt for, since it is not altogether what we are used to or easy to see. But all the same, let's try to get a hold of it. Tell me, given that this Constitution we talked about is, on our view, the only correct one, do you recognize that the others ought to employ the written documents that belong to this one and save themselves in that way, doing what is now praised, although it is not the most correct thing to do?" So I wonder here about this person. I wonder if he's looking for Christ in a way. And I sort of wonder if he's also looking at the form of this Constitution and saying, well, we can have this. That doesn't have to be this sort of step-down, limited thing. Limited in the sense that we're human beings. We can only process and handle so much information. And that it's stepped down necessarily because it's from the divine realm and to us. And since we can't inhabit that 100%, we are material creatures. We are material and soulful creatures, but we have this material body. So we're necessarily limited in our understanding and interpretation. Does this Constitution exist? And he mentions these imitations, and those are the things that fall short of it. So I think if anything can be said, if we find something that is successful, a Constitution that is successful, it brings us to a state that is higher than where we currently are. Okay, so the visitor mentions there's a mistake somewhere in here. And then he goes on to say, this sort of thing we must hunt for, since it is not altogether what we are used to or easy to see. And so he says, let's try to get a hold of it. So I'd like to pause here and to go through, once again, the etymology of the word constitution. So from the Latin we have constitutio, which means a settling, establishment, arrangement, or decree. From constituere, meaning to set up, establish, place together. From the prefix com, together, and stature, to cause, to stand, set, or place. So constitutio means literally a standing together, or that which is established together. So from Old French, Anglo-Norman, we have constitution. This is in the 12th through 13th century, meaning ordinance, regulation, or law, used in reference to both church decrees and order of a polity. In Middle English, the term referred to the system or structure of something, the arrangement of parts that make up a whole, as in the constitution of a body, the soul, or the state. In modern English, in the 16th century onward, the political meaning, the system of fundamental principles or laws governing a nation. This becomes dominant after the 17th century, especially with works by Hobbes and Locke, and later framers of the U.S. Constitution. So I think we should stay with the more fundamental, rooted sense of this. Because if we talk about the establishment of something or bringing something together to cause something to stand, bringing together parts to cause to stand, we can use this idea and extend it out into many different things. Now, the Constitution, as we discussed earlier, sort of our natural etymology as we went through the thought process, it includes, it is something of a precursor to that of a written law, let's say. It's a precursor because we understand that law is something that is based on something more fundamental, and the Constitution is meant to be that thing that is most fundamental. I find it difficult to say that a constitution can be written. I think it is possible, I suppose, to a degree. It would have to be something that would be open to amendment, but also something that is sufficiently wise to recognize the principles of change, but not to abandon the inherently conservative or traditional principles that provide structure and order. And moreover from this, the Constitution occupies this space almost like in the formal distinction that Plato uses, that the form of things rest above where man's experience is. Everything that manifests is a part of a broader form, of a more perfect, cohesive identity. And so now we have this idea of the one constitution, the only correct one. The visitor asks young Socrates, "Do you recognize that the others ought to employ the written documents that belong to this one?" And save themselves in that way, doing what is now praised, although it is not the most correct thing to do. So here we potentially run into this situation where the Constitution has become this traditional or conservative document for which it is most correct to adhere to it. And this idea of change as it relates to the step down, or the laws that are meant to surround this Constitution, that these laws are certainly subject to a similar type, or rather a type of degradation that a strict conservatism would not be appropriate for in select cases, especially given enough time. Do you recognize that the others ought to employ the written documents that belong to this one? So, if we are to say that there is some way by which we can ascertain what this most perfect Constitution says about the ordering of our society, that of the sort of the architecture of our society, not necessarily perhaps the order of institutions, but the foundation that would necessarily lead to having ordered institutions. The shape of institutions may change on top of it, but the principle underneath of ordering this is something that is fundamental. And the written sentiments that come from this offer us a view into what is that more perfect structure that we can create. And so I'm almost envisioning this sort of life force that we are tapping into, a constitutional life force. that is dynamic enough, agentic enough, to tell us, to provide us with the written documents that would order our societies, but also orient the mind in case of that confusion of disposition, such that the written documents that come from this original Constitution, perhaps they are fragmented by some unfortunate event or by the trespass of time, such that our memories degrade and our principles erode and our discipline fades. That underlying this, the experience is the thing, the experience of finding it and tapping into it is the way to relate to the Constitution. It is the way to find the order and the written direction by this Constitution. Of course, this is a religious pursuit. This is God comes to mind here. The divine logos comes to mind. The visitor says, and to save themselves in that way, doing what is now praised. Now, what does this mean? I take it to mean that by doing what is, by convention, according to the Constitution, the people are praised. They save themselves because they are doing what is correct, what is good. And then he says, although it is not the most correct thing to do. Now this he's probably referring to something earlier, in which the people that are adhering to this Constitution are referring to the true form, the true Constitution, and what they do now is against convention. Now, young Socrates says, what are you referring to? The visitor says, the principle that no one in the city should dare to do anything contrary to the laws, and that the person who dares to do so should be put to death, and all the worst punishments. This is very correct and fine as a second choice, when one changes the principle we discussed just now, which is our first choice. But let us go over the way in which what we called second best has come about. Do you agree? So, diving back into this, he begins by saying the principle that no one in the city should dare to do anything contrary to the laws. So we have a bit of I don't want to say a confusion, but an intermixing of the idea of the perfect form of the Constitution, the step down of the Constitution in the form of the laws, and then this sort of relative convention that exists somewhere in there. The convention is this thing that is established at some point that is not necessarily constitutional. In a way it is, in a way it's not. Constitutional if we can keep it foundational, orienting us to the good. And then on this way to the step down, the process of writing down these things into law, somewhere in there arises a convention. And the convention, I think, has to do with a degree of stability that is created by the laws. And as time goes by, just like a car that sits out in the elements, eventually things rust, things change. And if we don't keep up the maintenance, then the convention soon becomes a car that does not work. It's not practical any longer. Now he continues, this principle continues, and that the person who dares to do so should be punished by death and all the worst punishments. Now the reason for this is that if we have some established convention, the convention itself, regardless of its state of decay or where it's at in its life cycle, has within it a certain order to it. So even if it becomes impractical, it's still something that holds weight. it props up a structure, again, however ineffectual it might be, or effectual. It props up a structure of order that, if it were not present, would lead to the destruction of the whole, of the identity, and it would cause a fracturing of identity, a profound confusion, a breakdown in trust, a breakdown in institutions, and we would have all the familiar sorts of ailments that come with that. The insecurities of food sources, so we'd get famine, the inability to keep ourselves prudently aware of other pathogens. In the physical sense, we'd probably have disease. We'd be unable to prevent against natural disasters. Our infrastructure would decay. Many sort of similar things that I think we see now in the contemporary United States. Not across the board. I wouldn't want to make a case for some sort of absolute collapse of the United States, but the general trend is in that direction. He continues and he says, well, maybe I should say here that, again, the reason for this punishment is the preservation of the order. It's with good reason to say that if there's a sizable or even one strong individual that is leading a movement that causes this attempts to cause this profound disorder, then the risk is this. And so in order to prevent that, this person must be punished to the utmost extreme. He says, this is very correct and fine as a second choice, when one changes the principle we discussed just now, which is our first choice. But let us go over the way in which what we have called second best has come about. Do you agree? Now, I'm not exactly sure what he means here. By second best, I'm assuming that we are not talking about the Constitution, but rather the convention that is established by law. Young Socrates says, absolutely. Now the visitor continues, he says, well then, let's go back to the likeness, or the likenesses, to which we must always compare our kingly rulers. Young Socrates says, which likenesses? The noble steersman and the doctor, who is worth many others. Let us look at the matter by fashioning a kind of figure, using these as material. A figure of what kind? Of the following sort. Let's suppose that we all thought of them as doing the most terrible things to us. For the one as much as the other saves whichever of us he wishes to save, and whichever of us they wish to mutilate, they do it by cutting and burning us, and directing us to pay them expenses as if they were taxes, and of which they spend little or none on the patient, while they themselves and their household use the rest. And the final step is for them to take money from relatives or some enemies of the patient as pay for killing them. And steersmen, in their turn, bring about thousands of other things of a similar sort, leaving people stranded on voyages because of some conspiracy or other, causing shipwrecks on the seas and throwing people overboard, and doing other malicious things. Let's suppose, then, that we thought this, and came to a conclusion about them in a sort of council, no longer to allow either of these sorts of expertise to have autonomous control either of slaves or of free men, but to call together an assembly with ourselves as members, consisting either of the people altogether or only of the rich. The rule would be that both laymen and craftsmen, other than steersmen and doctors, would be permitted to contribute an opinion, whether about sailing or about diseases, as to the basis on which drugs and the tools of the doctor's art should be used on patients, and even how to employ
ships themselves and the tools of the sailor's art for operating them, for facing not only the dangers affecting the voyage itself from winds and sea, but encounters with pirates, and perhaps, if it should turn out to be necessary, for fighting a sea battle with longships against other of the same type. And once there was a record on Kerbase, and this is revolving columns on which the laws were traditionally inscribed in Athens, or blocks of stone of some sort, of what the majority had decided, whether with the advice of some doctors and steersmen, or of those who had no specialized knowledge of medicine or steersmanship, then all our sailing and caring for patients for all future time would have to be done according to this, along with certain other rules established as unwritten ancestral customs.
Okay, so we have to remember that we're considering the second best choice. This is the choice by rule of law, whereas the first best is going to be the choice by expert. The rule by the noble, steersman, statesman, king, whatever. And so we're going back to these likenesses. Another type of step down, or rather, I wouldn't say it is a step down, but perhaps a parallel, as he mentions the noble steersman and the doctor, who is worth many others. Interesting thing to say. But meaning that they have this expertise that very few people possess. And by that expertise, they have a particular pull in society. And so their worth, in a certain respect, is greater. Now we're putting together a type of figure using our archetypes, I guess, as material. So now we have a thought experiment. He says, let's suppose that we all thought them as doing the most terrible things to us. So we're taking the cynical approach of the doctor, of the steersman, of the king, whatever. For the one as much as the other saves whichever of us he wishes to save. Now here, we run into a problem of a lack of expertise. It is because of this lack of expertise that the doctor or the steersman is necessarily limited by the expertise that they can expend or spend on a particular patient, let's say. And many other patients will not be able to receive that care because they have to delegate their attention to specific cases. And by this, there is an antagonism that develops, perhaps a natural antagonism, for which, and I see this pattern often, and I think we'll have to explore it a bit more as it comes into light, but in the contemporary sense, I think that there is a strong relationship between what we are speaking about here and how either a rogue institution, and not just a matter of expertise, but an institution in general, a group of people, a collective, an agent, a spirit, how this may move through a collective, a society, through an individual's mind, and produce this antagonism, and yet the antagonism is directed at this sort of amorphous thing. There's a general sentiment that something is there to be dissatisfied at. But the justifications are often
difficult to come by. Now, in this case, it's made a little bit easier because we're imagining the people with expertise doing terrible things to us. We can go to COVID here as a somewhat similar parallel. He continues, he says, "And whichever of us they wish to mutilate, they do it by cutting and burning us and directing us to pay them expenses, as if they were taxes." And so this image emerges of an uncertainty at how a particular expertise will be used. On one hand, you have the good, and on the other hand, you have the bad. And it is this potential relationship between the two, the fallibility of the person with the expertise that has the capacity for good, but also can use their expertise to explore their own selfish desire by mutilating, experimenting, whatever it is. And they use this, the contrary, as an excuse to justify payment. They say that this they deserve because they are still exerting their expertise. And it doesn't matter how it's exerted. It is the fact that the expertise is being admitted, is being produced, of which they spend little or none on the patient of these taxes that are given. And of course we can think about the patient and the doctor scenario just as much as we think about the noble steersman, just as much as we think about the king or the statesman. While they themselves and their household use the rest. So this idea emerges about not only an improper usage of expertise, but then an improper usage of the value that is created by the expertise. The value is sucked inward. It is the furthering of this selfish gratification that was extended in the first place by this mutilation. And the final step is for them to take money from relatives or some enemies of the patient as pay for killing him. And here we have the malevolence of justification in action. There's a particular view, a particular perspective that comes from the expert. And of course it matters quite a bit. It affects everything downstream. And it brings to mind the disharmony that exists between the constitutional side of things and the later established law, and how far from that established constitution and the harmony of man's experience with one another, how far this can fall. Because instead of doing the patient good, it turns into the opposite. It is the justification, the belief, the self-belief, such that the expert is the one that ought to be paid for doing malevolent deeds, the opposite of what a good constitution would be. So today is a new day, and a new day brings new thoughts. And today I'm feeling a bit proverbial, thankfully. So I think it might afford us some interesting vantage points. So one thing I was thinking about was a personal matter related to a significant life change that is coming up. It's a good change, but nonetheless it is a change. And with any dramatic change, I think there are undeniable
provocations of the heart. That excited provocation, or the excited feeling, I suppose, that one gets from it. And within that excitement, if the mind is not attentive, it's not focused on something, it can turn into this angst, anxiety, that needs to be put somewhere, to be put to good use. And I'm thankful to have it. It's a bit of a fire that's been lit. And so I mention that because when I think about what we're reading here, I think about something that is a microcosm for something that is larger. Not only in the case of the doctor, but also in terms of the steersman, as the visitor mentions, when he says, and steersmen, in their turn, bring about thousands of other things of a similar sort, leaving people stranded on voyages because of some conspiracy or other, causing shipwrecks on the seas and throwing people overboard, and doing other malicious things. Now it seems quite clear that we all have this sort of steersman innately within us. And he can go one of two ways, or he can find himself in some graduated gray area that contains a little bit of both, a little bit of good, a little bit of bad, a little bit of this beneficence, a little bit of the maleficence, or whatever, maliciousness, whatever we want to call it. And there is this tension, an unfortunate tension. I mentioned the angst a moment ago. I think when one is caught within that angst, they are certainly going to be put under a certain amount of force. A certain amount of anxiety is going to come from that. The unproductive heart is never a fertile ground for good things. But also when the mind is focused on bad things, it brings it farther and farther away from that experience of goodness and of innocence. And by that there is this slow erosion of character and of love of life, I think. What ends up happening is not the cessation of joy, but the maximization of it within the selfish disposition. And so it's quite an unfortunate thing to think about somebody that is an expert in something, and yet does this towards selfish ends, or does it towards those wicked ends. And in the end, their responsibility goes unheld, unfulfilled. And for my part, when I think about the steersman, as he is going about his expertise, and yet he uses the position not to further himself, not to expand his expertise, not to do good by those whom he serves, but rather to exploit and to take advantage of. I think about all of those situations for which I give in to that lazy, lethargic disposition, but more than just that, an excuse such that the mind deserves something for its efforts, as if I am able to grant it by some superficial means satisfaction. And in the end, if I do satisfy it by letting the mind go into this sort of absent enjoyment of things, I waste precious time, number one.
But number two, when the mind finally comes around, comes out of the hole that it has excused for itself, what returns is this angst. It is the trial within the mind. The divinity has a certain way of keeping the mind honest, even if the mind overpowers, chooses not to listen to that divine tribunal. It is nonetheless there, and it may serve as a driver towards the farther delinquency and obstinance, or it may choose to listen and take the punishment, which in lesser forms of guilt is not as difficult to do, but in greater forms it is almost unbearable, because the pain is constant. It's not something that is just a couple lashes and that's it. There's a confinement of the realization and the reconciliation, which takes a period of time. And the scales from the smallest of fatigues and exhaustion through which we all go through. After work, for example, we have something to do, but we don't do it for whatever reason, all the way up until up to more serious things. Now the visitor mentions a sort of conspiracy as the reason why the steersman, or otherwise more generally our expert, diverts his course from goodness. And the conspiracy, again, I can't help but to think of only a few things at the principled level. It's either a profound selfishness, which is an extension of that wickedness, or it is what must one say? It is a form of evil, but of course the agent in that situation would be corrupted by something beyond it. It's sort of the soil through which the evil spirit facilitates its own expression. For evil as a living being is a contradiction, because by the end of its experience, its sole desire is for the destruction of that which is, and the creative pursuit is the Antichrist. And by this opposing transformation of something to nothing for the sake of nothing, and the desire for any sort of mercy or grace or forgiveness to be seen at all in the world to diminish, I think that it's less likely that this type of conspiracy would occupy the mind of the expert, but it's always possible. I think it's more likely that it's the wicked, selfish disposition, but I suppose it doesn't really matter too much. He continues, he says, "Let's suppose, then, that we thought this, and came to a conclusion about them in a sort of council, no longer to allow either these sorts of expertise to have autonomous control either of slaves or of free men, but to call together an assembly with ourselves as members, consisting either of the people altogether or only the rich." So what are we doing here? It is by our concern for the potential disposition of an expert, which by extension is something that is potentially common to all of us. And instead of saying that, no, we need an expert for their knowledge, for their responsibilities, we outsource some decision making to a council, to some body. We diminish their responsibility, their role, their power.
He says no longer to allow of these sorts of expertise to have autonomous control. So we take away their agency. We take away their agency, we take away their ability to solve problems adequately. We remove that one potential avenue, one important potential avenue, through which the natural relation of their mind may encounter the world and subsequently problems. These problems through which or by which the solving of them, that is necessary for our various purposes. In this case, it is the solving of disease or the management of a society or the safe navigation of a vessel. Now we have this sort of emerging picture of a democracy and the negative attitude towards it. Now it's not just the democracy, of course, because he says the people, or only the rich, which is that small group of people, the oligarchs, or potentially the aristocrats. There's the two divisions that are there. He says, the rule would be that both laymen and craftsmen, other than steersmen and doctors, would be permitted to contribute an opinion, whether about sailing or about diseases, as to the basis on which drugs, and the tools the doctor's art should be used on patients, and even how to employ ships themselves, and the tools of the sailor's art for operating them, for facing not only the dangers affecting the voyage itself from winds and sea, but encounters with pirates, and perhaps, if it should turn out to be necessary, for fighting a sea battle with longships against others of the same type. Now, the word that comes to mind here is bureaucracy. Now, what's interesting in this case is that we're not necessarily talking about a government or some civil polity. We're talking about something that is, I suppose, institutional in a way. We speak about the physicians, we think about the institutions that are associated with them. We think about regulation of them. Now, of course, it would make sense that there would be some civil polity that this would be attached to. So if we are speaking about a bureaucrat, this would be reasonable. Now, I'd like to go through the etymology of the word bureaucrat. Now, from its roots, we have the French from the mid-18th century, formed from bureau, which is desk or office, plus a Greek-derived suffix, meaning power or rule. So we have the rule by the office, or desk power. And if we are to compare it here to what Plato is speaking about, there is a close relationship between this separation between the person that is doing the deciding about what the scope of practice should be or what the tools are, and what is allowed in terms of the expertise of a particular individual. But by the same token, we have somebody that is not related to the profession or of the discipline that those for whom they regulate are in. Now, from medieval Latin, we have the word burrus, meaning dark red or brown, describing the cloth's color. By the 17th century, bureau meant office or administrative department. Now, the suffix crat or crassi
from ancient Greek, we have strength, power, and authority. The same root gives us democracy, rule of the people, aristocracy, rule of the best, theocracy, rule of God. Now he continues and he says, and once there was a record on blocks of stone of some sort of what the majority had decided, whether with the advice of some doctors and steersmen, or of those who had no specialized knowledge of medicine or steersmanship. Then all our sailing and caring for patients for all future time would have to be done according to this, along with certain other rules established as unwritten ancestral customs. So we face a difficult problem. On one hand, there, at least in my mind, there is this cultural inheritance and civic responsibility of the individual, the importance of the individual, and his contribution to society, and how it ought to be governed, let's say. And then on the other hand, we are faced with this reasonable assertion that despite there being experts, people can really only specialize in a few areas. And of course, by this specialization, it limits their understanding in other areas. So nobody is truly an expert in all matters. But when it comes to the civic responsibility, there are people who are experts in that domain. And so it sort of remains an open question. Well, how do we work our way through this? How do we reconcile between the disruption of the experts' time, through which not only their expertise but also their further progression of it may be affected, but also controlling against malevolence on the part of so-called experts that do not use their expertise towards goodness? Now, young Socrates says, what you've described is distinctly odd. The visitor continues, yes, and let's suppose that a further conclusion was that we should set up officers annually who belong to the mass of people, whether from the rich or from the whole people, whoever has office assigned to him by lot, and that those who take office should execute it by steering the ships and healing patients according to the written rules. So here we are finding ourselves in an interesting territory, certainly reasonable territory, in the sense that we've established that these laws, they come from some stronger constitutional source. The Constitution is this way of thinking. Perhaps it's a dialectical method by which we come to understand things that are true. On the most basic level, we have to understand how things are related to one another. And by their relations, we understand the expression of certain foundational concepts, like what is good, what is just, what is correct. And so by these relations, we understand them also to be not static, unfortunately. We can identify things that are relatively stable over time, but many things change in time. And even the most elements, a slight shift, that slight relation, I think, can make things appear slightly different. And so a particular law may not necessarily be as warranted or effective in a changed era. even given small changes in the cultural makeup. And so now we have this, what appears to be this distributed system by which officers are elected, and they go and represent particular bodies. They instruct particular bodies. And in this particular case, the layperson is directing bodies by which they have no opinion. Well, they have an opinion, but they have no expertise. They don't know how to treat patients. They don't know how to navigate a ship. But they make these decisions, again, for the sole purpose that their election by office is to prevent against the extremes of malevolence in the expertise themselves. And so by these laws, we control against perhaps what has happened before, but we don't leave open that dynamism that is necessary for the realization of a solution set to come about. Because in the case of the former, the laws are restrictive. There's good reason perhaps to restrict, because we found something that is there to restrict that should not and ought not to happen again. Something so egregious and foundational, such as the perversion of the expertise into malevolence. But in its heavy-handed restriction, we have the incompetence of that rigid structure that we put in place. And the very thing that we were afraid of, the dynamism that had allowed the malevolence, the dynamism is also the thing that would allow the beneficence. And so the question is, well, how do we take this dynamism and I have an urge, and I'm trying to resist the urge to say control or to channel, to filter it in such a way that what we get are the desirable elements and what we reduce are the undesirable. Now, young Socrates says this is even harder to take in response to the visitor. And the visitor says, then consider too what follows after this. When the year ends for each and every one of the officers, there will be a requirement to set up courts, either of the rich on the basis of a pre-selection or against those chosen by lot from the whole people together, and to bring before these judges those who have held office, in order to examine their conduct. Anyone who wishes will be permitted to charge an officer that he failed to steer the ships during the year according to the written rules, according to the ancient customs of our ancestors. There will be these same requirements also in the case of those healing the sick, and for any officers condemned by the vote. The judges will have to assess what penalty they should suffer or what financial restitution they should make. So this image kind of sounds like communism. Not that we should give a superficial label to what we were talking about here, because we're more at the bedrock, I think. Because now there's this image of this bureaucratic class. They're getting together in front of these courts. And they are accusing, potentially, so this is the secondary tribunal that is set up to hold to account the officers that were meant to hold to account the experts, it would seem. And by holding to account these officers for failing to properly take care of
the patience or properly steer the ship, not based on expertise, but based on ancient custom. And by this, there will be some penalty. Young Socrates says, well, anyone who willingly and voluntarily undertakes to hold office under such conditions would fully deserve to suffer any penalty whatever, and to pay back any amount. The visitor continues, he says, and further still, it would be necessary to establish a law against all the following things. Suppose anyone is found inquiring into the steersmanship and seafaring, or health and truth of the doctor's art in relation to winds and heat and cold, above and beyond the written rules, and making clever speculations of any kind in relation to such things. In the first place, one must not call him an expert doctor or an expert steersman, but a stargazer, some babbling sophist. The next provision will be that anyone who wishes from among those permitted to do so shall indict him, and bring him before some court or other as corrupting other people younger than himself, and inducing them to engage in the arts of the steersman and the doctor, not in accordance with the laws, but instead by taking autonomous control of ships and patients. If he is found guilty of persuading anyone, whether young or old, contrary to the laws and the written rules, the most extreme penalty shall be imposed on him. For, so the law will say, there must be nothing wiser than the laws. No one is ignorant about what belongs to the art of the doctor, or about health, or what belongs to the art of the steersman, or seafaring, since it is possible for anyone who wishes to understand things that are written down and things established as ancestral customs. Suppose then these things came about, Socrates, in a way we say, in both relation to these sorts of expert knowledge and to generalship and all the art of hunting or whatever kind, to painting or any part whatever of all the art of imitation, to carpentry, the whole of tool-making, to whatever kind, or again, farming and the whole of expertise that deals with plants. Or again, suppose we imagined a sort of horse-rearing that took place according to written rules, or all of herd-keeping, or the art of divination, or every part included in the art of subordinate or petia, all the science of numbers, whether perhaps dealing with them on their own, or in 2 dimensions, or in solids, or in speeds. If all of these were practiced in this way, and they were done on the basis of written rules and not on the basis of expertise, what on earth would be the result? So let's start with the first part of this statement, because this is eerily reminiscent of our recent experience with COVID. He says, and further, still it will be necessary to establish a law against all the following things. Suppose anyone is found inquiring into steersmanship and seafaring, or health and truth in the doctor's art, in relation to winds and heat and cold, above and beyond the written rules, and making clever speculations of any kind in relation to such things. So there's the implication that what is highest is the established or written rules, and these things are not subject to change. And because they are not subject to change, we spoke about this, but this is just perhaps a different angle. The interesting thing is that there's a potential demarcation. Now, ideally, the written rules will not disagree with some inquiry into the nature of the truth of something. You would want the written rules established such that it allows for such a thing, rather than the written rules to establish an order of truth that cannot be questioned.
when I said it's eerily reminiscent of COVID is because we had this trust the science approach, which just meant trust what the established institutions are telling you and don't look into it. And of course, there is no way by which one can come to understanding something that is true if one does not do the difficult and disciplined work of doing the honest inquiry and learning the relevant information. So I'll read it one more time. Suppose anyone is found inquiring into steersmanship and seafaring, or health and truth, and the doctor's art, in relation to winds and heat and cold, above and beyond the written rules, and making clever speculations of any kind in relation to such things. In the first place, one must not call him an expert doctor or an expert steersman, but a stargazer, some bambling sophist. Now this is the response of the immune system of that established order, the established order that has gone astray, that does not or no longer facilitates the gathering of truth, but rather what it wishes to preserve is the structure, is the power of itself. Again, it's interesting because there's a pattern here. There's a pattern in the sense that this structure of written laws had came about because of a situation of malevolence that had occurred in the dramatic sense in the case of the steersman who intentionally drove the ships into the rocks, or misguided sailors, or the physician who mutilated people and expected them to pay for the death of the person that they had murdered. This itself was a type of institution. Then what came through was a law and regulation that looked over the expertise of the person. But where they were looking was not where they ought to have been looking. Well, maybe this is not accurate, because you would want the eyes to go over the expertise, just like in this case, in the case of the laws that have become too restrictive, you want the eyes to be able to look over the expertise and see the truth of the matter. Of course, there has to be more that is done on the part of the layperson in order to understand. But nonetheless, in this case, as in the case of the former, establishing some certain understood method by which one comes to the truth of something is the primary focus. When this all goes south, there seems to be that common pattern of selfish disposition. In the case of the malevolence on the expert, such that while they may have the expertise, their orientation matters. And while in the case of the latter, they may not have the expertise, and their orientation of preventing against malevolence makes themselves malevolent and creates a structure that is self-serving and restrictive, that does not allow for the truth. And so it seems like the silver lining is having some sort of structure or order that exposes falsehood and guides correctly. Again, in the first place, one must not call him an expert doctor or expert statesman, but a stargazer, some bambling sophist. The next provision will be that anyone who wishes from among those permitted to do so shall indict him and bring him before some court or other as corrupting other people younger than himself and inducing them to engage in the arts of the steersman and the doctor, not in accordance with the laws, but instead by taking autonomous control of ships and patients. Now this reminds me of the actual Socrates, that he went through this experience. By his questioning, he was submitted to the authority of his day, and drove to commit suicide for his beliefs. Now, what can be said about this? The claim on the part of the structure, or let's call it the machine, is such that there is no right on the part of the layperson to question the expert, because they will potentially introduce a corrupting effect on the nature or the form of the expert, let's say. The very thing, by the way, that law is trying to prevent against. But in this case, it's preventing somebody from having a just cause of questioning, from making it a coherent legal case. And instead of facilitating that towards goodness and truth, they are locking it down. They are prosecuting that individual that pursues the truth. Now, of course, this can just as easily be somebody that is going against the convention and the laws by good measure prevent them from corrupting the society. Perhaps there's an inherent malevolence in this contravention, in which case we would call it good. We would have to, I suppose. Good in the sense that the laws had taken care of the malevolence. But it's ineffective because it's too self-centered. It cannot see goodness beyond itself. If itself is threatened. Now, I think there's more to be said there. Now, let's see. So, the next provision will be that anyone who wishes from among those permitted to do so shall indict him and bring him before some court or other as corrupting other people younger than himself, and inducing them to engage in the arts of the steersman and their doctrine not in accordance with the laws, but instead by taking autonomous control of ships and patients. So autonomous. So here we have a key word. This is a control against otherness, but it's also a control against a type of self. And I feel like this is quite a dynamic thing, because on one hand we have the autonomy of the machine, which is let's say the convention or the institution that upholds the convention by the written law. And then we have the agency of the individual that is performing this contravention. And then we have the expertise, which is and of itself subject to this beneficence and malevolence, which is in part why we have the laws in the first place, to prevent against the malevolence. But because the state has this autonomous aspect to itself, it's not self-sacrificial. It's quite the opposite in this case. It's self-preserving, because if there was a contravention to the law, it would be a contravention to that identity. And if the identity is to maintain itself, then it can't transform itself. It can't deny itself. So by that rigid structure of the identity that is not allowed to transform, not allowed to perform a degree of self-sacrifice, it restricts the autonomy of others. And again, it can go either way. And it's by this fear of the autonomous person, the person that doesn't have the rigor of education or the certified and secure form of expertise that they are used to, then it raises this potential for something, for some anxiety to take over, something unproductive potentially. If he is found guilty of persuading anyone, whether young or old, contrary to the laws and the written rules, the most extreme penalties shall be imposed on him. Because if it is contrary, then what is at risk is the destruction of the identity of the system or the machine that would otherwise submit him to that standard written rule. And they would rather preserve the written rule, because that's what the identity does, rather than transform itself. There's nothing, I suppose we have to think about what it would necessarily mean for this structure to be able to have a type of self-awareness that would understand when to look at a law in a particular context and not push aside the potential for goodness and truth when it presents itself. The visitor continues, he says, so the law will say, there must be nothing wiser than the laws. And this is the real crux of it, because this is where, of those that participate in the machine, that form its gears, that give it its bodily manifestation in our world, it is the chief object of worship of that agent, that the law itself is the wisest. It is not God. It is not a constitution. It is not something higher than itself. But it is, by some reason, to give it its credit, is something that has been established. Some experience, perhaps some painful experience in the past. We talked about it with this malevolence of the doctor and the steersman, that had caused them to be apprehensive about something. No one is ignorant about what belongs to the art of the doctor, or about health, or what belongs to the art of a steersman or seafaring, since it is possible for anyone who wishes to understand things that are written down and things established as ancestral customs. So this, of course, can go both ways. We can imagine a scenario in which a person that is curious, that is educated, that reads the material necessary to understand a particular expertise, by their discipline, they can achieve things that are akin to an expert. On the other hand, they can understand what the expert is given the written material, and so by that they should be able to understand what the ancestral custom is. Now he continues, he says, suppose then these things came about, Socrates, in the way we say, both in relation to these sorts of expert knowledge and to generalship, and all the art of hunting of whatever kind, to painting, or any part whatever of all the art of imitation, to carpentry, the whole of tool making, or whatever kind, or again farming, and the whole of the expertise that deals with plants. Or again, suppose we imagined a sort of horse rearing that took place according to written rules, or all herd keeping, or the art of divination, or every part included in the art of the subordinate, or petia, or all the science of numbers, whether perhaps dealing with them on their own, or in two dimensions, or in solids, or in speeds. If all of these were practiced in this way, and they were done on the basis of written rules and not on the basis of expertise, what on earth would be the result? So we ask the question, if all forms of expertise are based on written rules, much like we've discussed with the laws, where as we have come down to laws, we understand them to be based on some more fundamental form of constitution, where expertise, much like the weaver, is something highly specific. Though we did not necessarily speak of the weaver and the way that they grow into their expertise, we do have an understanding that if the weaver was to be limited by a sense of rigidity, now based on practice and custom, most cloths would be the same. Most forms of clothing would be the same. In terms of innovation, there would be very little, because what must be done is to be performed by what is written, what is the standard. And although there may be plenty of positive benefits from approaching problems in this way, by having an extra layer of security that has been established over time, it reduces our dynamic experience of life. And in the absence or in the strictly controlled sense that reduces this dynamism, what we have is a degradation of expertise. And the visitor lists all sorts of different kinds of expertise, but within all of them, we would see this reduction in sophistication, the reduction in the relationship among parts of things, both such that when a person outside views an expertise, they are unable to understand it. There is this sort of sophistry that's associated with the expertise that is bounded by written rules or written obligations, in the sense that when times change, perhaps when technologies change and the necessary relations among things change, then so too will the written rules or the way in which one approaches production or the productive spirit. Now I think I'm going to end this episode here. We have gone on long enough. And we'll continue next time with part 13 of The Statesman.